Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Andromeda 7 Celestial Gateway, your community support channel for love, communication, interaction, research, knowledge, and support. And we're very happy this evening to have with us our special guest, Anyextee from Adept Expeditions. Hello, Anyextee. Thank you for coming.
Hello, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this evening we have our panelists from Australia. We have our Aussie bird, Jules, the alchemist. And Mandy Moo will be jumping on shortly. She's dealing with a customer at the moment. And we have Karen, Queen of Quartz, the developer, of course, of the Crystal Network, and our hard rock miner. And we have Trina Phoenix, our angel sister of great knowledge and teaching and wisdom. And we're so honored to have her participate in these programs because she really adds value to the discussion. And we'd be reminiscent without her here. And then we have Dalibor Suchi over in Germany, who's actually from Prague. And he's staying in Germany for a while because he's locked down there because of what's going on around the world. So we also have Lori, Pure Love Ascension. And everybody knows, our regular viewers know that Lori provides the server for this production. And she drives the graphics and the flow of the evening's production. And we would be lost without her. There would be no show. So we appreciate your time and effort into everything, including the opening video. Great job. Great job. Okay, well, before we get into further detail with with Anyextee, I would like to just do a special announcement this evening, and then we'll greet our chat room folks as they come in. We heard some fairly unpleasant news this morning, and our thoughts, hearts, and intents go out to Wayne Steiger. He lost his father last night, and although the next few days will be challenging to you, Wayne, please know that we care deeply for you and your family. Mm-hmm. And as part of your family, we're here for you for whatever you might need. And we've all lost so many folks. A lot of us have lost family members and close friends and people that we love about here lately. And although we know they're gone in the flesh, we carry their spirit in our hearts and in our minds. And we know that they're walking with us in our continued journeys along the way. And we hope you know that too, Wayne. And much love to you, brother. And thank you for always being there for us. Just know at this time we're here for you too.
Absolutely.
Okay. Much love to you, Wayne. Okay, Lori, since you can see the chat room, I know folks are still filtering in. Would you mind reading
bet.
chat room
Jules
for us?
M., thank you for setting the reminder. Much appreciation for that. David Castle, as always, you're always right there. Lucky Stone, the same with you. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate you. Doug Stack, love you, brother. Good to see you. Grandpa Brian, love you so much. Thank you for being here. Let's see, we've got my sister, Kelsey8. Good to have you with us, Kelly. We have Joey from Two Cute Pagans React. Thanks for being here, brother. Paul Joe, such a pleasure to have you with us. Odds, Audrey, so good to see you, sister. Always a pleasure. Johan Dancing Gypsy, so good to see you. Glad that you're here and with us. Elderberry, always a pleasure. Yeah. Mary Wins, love you, sister. Good to see you. It's looking like, William Swan Jr., very good to see you. Someone's using their real name. I'm not sure who you are, but good to have you with us. And let's see, I think
Brandy Robinson.
Brandy Robinson, always. Yep, Brandy, you're a fine girl. Good to have you with us. Posey, Ed Hagel.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep. Well,
lots
we got
of folks
quite a
in here
tonight, so it's a pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you for being with us.
And you got your friend on here, Anyextee. Audrey Roden is here.
Oh, hello to Audrey.
You know, before I've been following you for quite some time on Facebook, and I said to Audrey, "Oh, I would love to get him on here."
I was like, yes.
He's so busy and he's traveling all the time, and I know you've had some issues with your wife too. And I'm so glad she's back on her feet and out and about now a little bit too. But I was just like, the chances of getting next, because I happen to know him, and I'm like, oh, cool. You know, Audrey, she knows everybody.
Yes, she does. It's amazing.
There's been a long line of podcasters requesting interviews, but I had to do this one for Audrey. So,
we love that.
Well, we appreciate it very much. I know you're a man with limited time. You know, what I'm going to do is turn this over to you and Dalibor to talk. And I thought before you get into some detailed questions that he might have come up with for you and some of the other panelists,
sure,
give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about Adept Expeditions. And some of your experiences and tours around the world. And it's not just Egypt. I know you and your wife do South America as well.
Yeah, well, Central America, we focus on Mexico. And that's really where it started in terms of an operation, a tour operator that essentially is providing more meaningful experiences than your typical spectator tours. It started really, I mean, I've had the idea, I've been touring and exploring for years. But when we got married in Mexico, in the Yucatan, at the ancient Maya city of Uxmal, by the pyramids, by way of a traditional Maya ceremony from a shaman there, he's one of the most venerated shaman in the Yucatan. We wanted to, we literally spent the next 2 weeks of our honeymoon, quote unquote, not on the beach, not just hanging out, you know, it was literally spent going out, checking out all the ancient sacred sites, going off the beaten path into the jungle, even in some cases on private land, looking for lesser known and obscure structures and pyramids. We've always gone and done these trips back and forth to and from Mexico, but we absolutely fell in love with the Yucatan and each other. And we got married there. And we wanted to recreate that experience. So the following year, we're going to go back and do a private research trip. But we've always, when I was doing these trips and I would come back with pictures or videos on Facebook, a lot of our friends would, I want to go. And so it made sense to, form the company around that. And that's sort of how it started. But, it could go back even a little further. I was mentored by the late, great John Anthony West, symbolist, author, and tour leader himself. He led Magical Egypt symbolist tours to Egypt for decades. And so I studied in Egypt under him. At the end, we talked about training me up and some others to essentially teach and perpetuate what it was that John was teaching. And he was perpetuating the work of occultist and hermeticist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz, which is the work of the sacred science. It's sort of a holistic way of approaching Egypt in terms of viewing the ancient world and their ontology, because the way that we view the world now with our Western eyes and our our perception is and can be somewhat limited. The same applies for the academic world, which is writing our textbooks and giving us our history. A lot of Egyptology began in the 1900s, and it was written mostly by Europeans, and relying heavily on accounts from Greek philosophers who were coming into Egypt at a very late period. And so we have what could have possibly been a somewhat of a lost translation between the ancient Egyptian priests to the Greeks themselves, who were just trying to interpret and understand these ideas. We can go back to the words of Plato and the account of Solon, and how the ancient priests of Egypt were explaining to Solon how the Greeks were like children. Their maturity level, their even spiritual maturation may not have been at the same level clearness or higher level of consciousness as the ancient Egyptian priests. And then from there, we have to interpret that today after years, of different conditioning and programming from our variety of religions and institutions, and academia itself has trained us to approach things in a specific way. And so we look at Egypt, with a very, what Schwaller would refer to as the intelligence of the mind, where he also calls for us to view Egypt with what's called the intelligence of the heart. This was the intelligence of the ancient Egyptians. It's approaching it not necessarily just reading the language, but understanding it at a deeper, heartfelt level, really approaching it. My work is to look at everything through an esoteric lens and approaching it in that way. And so my mentor, John Anthony West, would lead these trips, which are unlike anything else. It's not your traditional spectator tour where you just go and you look at the sites. You're going to get the academic perspective, as well as a deeper, more meaningful, really esoteric lessons as well, but a deeper, more meaningful view of Egypt by looking at it through the symbolist approach. And so I've carried that work on into the Yucatan and Mexico, where I do it with the Maya sites, as well as continuing in that tradition of my mentor, John Anthony West, leading these tours in Egypt. We've also done Turkey. Eventually, we're going to add India, Peru, and more sites, as well as I would like to eventually do an Ancient America tour. I've been to Cahokia Mound, Serpent Mound. We were talking before this program about New England's mysterious stone chambers. And so there's a lot here where I'm at in the States. And so Adept Expeditions will eventually expand and take on more. But right now, with all things considered, the situation's still somewhat liquid with the pandemic. We're just going to focus on Egypt for this year. I do tours. I operate tours to Egypt every year, at least once a year. We do the annual Esoteric Egypt tour in September. Sometimes I'll do tours in January or March as well, depending on the year and the climate. And in addition to that, we do our annual Mysteries of the Maya trip in the Yucatan. Although we will not be doing it this year, and the only reason for that is the historical Uxmal Hacienda, which is located directly across the street from the Uxmal Pyramid Complex, has been closed. It's closed down for a little while. The archaeological site is open, but essentially the hotel, the hacienda, the historical hacienda where we stay, is currently not open. And some of the lesser known sites that we visit along the Puc route in the Yucatan are closed down as well. So we want to give people the optimal experience. We always love to over deliver with value for our clients who come on tours with us. And so we decided to just postpone that trip this year because we know it would essentially compromise the experience, and we don't want that. However, Egypt is back up and running. I know groups that have been going to Egypt, one that just went a couple of weeks ago. Tourism is returning to Egypt for the most part. It's pretty much operational. Yeah, so we're excited to get back in September for the Lost Technologies and Symbolism Tour, which I will be leading with my colleague and co-speaker, Christopher Dunn, who is a renowned engineer and best-selling author. He's appeared on History Channel's Ancient Aliens. He's put out 2 books. He formulated the Giza power plant theory, as well as Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, his 2nd book. So I'm very excited. I haven't been to Egypt with Chris Dunn yet. I actually met him at the CPAC conference, which is the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. We were speaking about Audrey. Audrey was there. Teresa, were you there as well? Were you
No.
there? No. Okay.
I wish.
Well, that's actually, I knew Chris Dunn before that. We had correspondence online, but that was the first time we actually got to meet in person. I think he was impressed with my presentation, and then we started talking about doing the tour together. And so that's how it came about. I'm really excited to travel to Egypt. I do this all the time, and it's the Esoteric Egypt tour. But because this year we changed the theme to lost technologies and symbolism, I'm really excited about this concept, this convergence of the symbolism and the sacred science merging with the concept of lost technology. And who better to go with than Chris Dunn? He is the pioneer in the field of lost technology in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, I had planned on it, but things didn't work out for me this time around. But I'm chomping at the bit for that one. Both tours. You know,
well, you'll be able to catch the replay. I typically do film and document a lot of my tours and try to pick up footage while I'm there and come back. And I've only recently, in the last few months, since we've all been home, I've been focusing more on my YouTube channel. I'm typically more active on Facebook, but I'm trying to shift gears a bit to help widen my audience. I feel like I've plateaued with Facebook and YouTube. There's just a lot of visibility there that I'm missing. So in the last few months, I've been focused on creating content. I have years, we're talking decades,
I know,
of footage and hard drives collecting dust from around the world. Ancient sites in Japan, China, Mexico, Egypt, very obscure, lesser known sites. I have pyramids. I'm going to be doing a video on a lost pyramid that is not on any map that you would see of the Yucatan. It rivals Chichen Itza in size. And just a lot of exciting stuff. I can't produce the videos as fast as I'd like to.
I know.
Amazing work.
What I like that you do, which is so thoughtful, is when you're actually in the middle of these tours, is you'll go live for 10 minutes or 15 minutes on Facebook with your students right in the middle of a structure, inside of a pyramid or down deep in a tunnel, and you'll be like, hey, everybody. And then you show us what you're looking at.
Yeah,
I think so that's really nice that you do that occasionally.
I enjoy doing that, and I feel like it's really good for the viewers at home on social media. Because look, I know these trips are expensive. That's not by choice. The profit margins are very small. We really deliver an optimal experience, and at the end of the day, it's deeper. It's not about the money. Obviously, yes, I have a 9-year-old daughter and a sick wife at home, and I have to provide for my family. But ultimately, I don't do this for the money. It's much, much deeper than the money. And so, we want to make the trips affordable, but unfortunately, it's very expensive to go to Egypt and see Egypt in the way that we see it. We do offer a lot of exclusive access and special permissions access that requires permits, very expensive permits, to get you into some places that are often passed over by that casual tourists. So while I'm there, the way that I lay out the trips, we like to give time to our groups to just experience and feel before I bias them with all the information. So what we do when we go to a site, typical protocol, is to let them go and just walk around and experience it first intuitively. Then we'll come back and have a discussion. Then we'll actually run the tour where I give you all the blah, blah, blah. And I'm talking about everything, but this way you get the experience and, the educational aspect, and we cover everything. From the archaeology to the anthropology, to the mysteries, to the history, to the more metaphysical and spiritual aspects, and obviously my interest, the deeper esoteric aspects of a lot of these structures. But to be able to show people on Facebook, and it's a big deal because not everyone can afford to be there or are in position to go. And so this is my way of basically bringing Egypt to you. If you can't come with us, fine, but you can follow me on Facebook or subscribe to my YouTube channel, Anyextee, ANYEXTEE on YouTube, and you can follow along in a lot of our journeys.
Well, you do have a unique, I thought it was fairly unique, at least I haven't seen a whole lot of it. You have an actual boat. What do you call those? The float, basically, to go down the Nile, to drop off, to go to all these different places, and people stay on that boat, do they not? It's like a cruise ship, but it's, what do they call it, a barge?
So this one is, the one you're referring to is likely the Dahabeya, which is one of the oldest type of boats in ancient Egypt that goes back. And it's been the traditional boat when a lot of the early Europeans and early Egyptologists would come to Egypt and go down the Nile, they would do so by dahabeah, which is essentially a yacht. And so it's like having a private yacht in Egypt.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, the tour, unfortunately, the tour that I'm doing with Christopher Dunn, we're not going to do the dahabeah. We're going to do a luxury Nile cruise ship, because this tour is already getting, typically, my tours, I like to keep smaller, intimate groups in between 12 to 16 to 20 people. This one, because it's 2 guests, it's going to be a little bigger. It's probably going to be about double the size. It's actually about to sell out at double the size. And so we have to default this time to the Nile cruise, which are still nice. There's really 3 ways of seeing Egypt, right? Oh, you could just go to Egypt and see Giza and the pyramids and still love it and go home. But if you really want to see Egypt, it does require the full 2 weeks to go down the Nile and get the whole chronology to see the old kingdom, the new kingdom, And so to do that, you're either going to drive on a bus in the heat, which can be very uncomfortable. That's not the sort of situation we want to create for people. Or we go on a Nile, and you can either take the luxury Nile cruise ships or the private dahabeah. And the smaller groups I lead, we usually do the
dahabeah. Yeah, I've seen your videos, and they're just phenomenal. And I'm like glued to it. And the time y'all jumped in the Nile, I thought they're going to get eaten by a crocodile, or they out of their minds, But no, it's beautiful. And the dahabeah is gorgeous inside and out. The dining area, the patio area. Just tell me something. How is it that you, compared to some of your colleagues, and it's got to be because of your relationship with John Anthony West and Christopher Dunn, it's just got to be, you get into places that nobody else gets into. How is that possible?
So, well, the Christopher Dunn relationship is new. I've known Chris for a little while online, but like I said, we just recently met 2019. I've been leading tours before that. And yes, I have to give credit to John Anthony West, my mentor. Interestingly enough, my first trip to Egypt was not a tour. It was not with a group. It was not with the safety and comfort of a group. It was myself and 2 others. I had been in the music industry for over 20 years, and it was a transitional period where I left music and I was doing more filmmaking. And I ended up getting involved with this project with an American glass artist. And it was essentially, he went to Egypt and he got trapped there during the revolution, the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. He had a glass shop in Egypt. He was teaching local Egyptians new techniques, because traditionally glass art goes back to Egypt and Mesopotamia. And traditionally Egyptians would just paint on clear glass with chemical color. He was bringing colored glass, organic glass alchemy to Egypt. And so it was a higher standard, and he was teaching them different techniques. And while he was there, he got trapped in the revolution. Eventually came back, but he left his life's work behind. And so we worked on a documentary project that I produced called Egypt Through the Glass Shop. This was my first experience in Egypt. Before, I had always been fascinated with the culture. I've always been interested in Western esotericism and the mysteries of man. But, it wasn't, and the strange thing is, I had a bunch of synchronicities at the end of the year. It was all lining up. I was constantly having these recurring vivid dreams, seeing the image of the Sphinx. And that was unusual for me. I wasn't even studying Egypt at the time. I just felt a deep inner calling. And so I began to think about Egypt during the day more often. And I'd keep having this dream. I had it about 4 or 5 times, and it left such an impact on me. I didn't know what it meant. And then randomly I met this glass artist, and then he tells me his story, how he just came back from Egypt, and I was blown away. And I was working on another documentary. I put that on the side to focus on this project with him. I immediately set it up so that we'd be flying out to Egypt a week after meeting him. And it was essentially him and my DP at the time, a director. I was producing, and I brought in a director of photography, Brian Petchers. He was the head of Forbes magazine's video department, and I knew him from the music industry. We worked on music videos together. So it was Brian and this artist that goes by the name Tsunami, and we traveled to Egypt. But I had spent about a month there. We filmed for about 2 weeks and got the film done and came back. And yes, I went to the Giza Plateau, saw the pyramids, climbed the pyramids, and but didn't really get the education that I wanted. I wanted to know more. I saw the hieroglyphs. I didn't know what it meant. When I get interested in a topic, I like to study with a borderline unhealthy obsession. to the point where, I go in, I have to look at everything and read everything and spend hours, absorbing it all. So I came back and, I was already familiar with John Anthony West from his Emmy Award-winning film in the 90s. I remember him, making a lot of waves, especially I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Robert Schoch, his colleague, was teaching in Boston at that time. And so there was a lot of press around their work as it related to redating the Sphinx based on water erosion. But it wasn't until I came back from that trip and I went back searching and studying and meanwhile producing this film. And I came back into the work of John Anthony West. And one thing led to another. I reached out to John about joining one of his trips, but he told me that it was going to be a private trip. It was with the Enneagram Institute. They were no longer accepting anyone. However, I think he noticed in my email signature, I had a link to my work, and he watched the trailer to my video, realized I had already been to Egypt and filmed in Egypt. And then John contacted me back after telling me there was no space on his tour and said, well, hey, can you call me? And and he picked up the phone, talked to John, and he said, well, Egypt is warming up to letting people bring cameras back in and film. And I noticed you did this documentary film and you're a filmmaker. I would love to have you film the tour. And, you could come with me and stay in my room. You could stay as a roommate with me. Here's my opportunity to travel with the legend, the great granddaddy of them all. John Anthony West has inspired the likes of, Graham Hancock and best-selling authors like Robert Paul. And, and it trickles all the way down to the YouTubers that are covering ancient mysteries today. Many of us have John Anthony West to thank. So here's my opportunity to travel with John. My mind is blown. And there's a much longer story. Maybe I'll do a video about this one day, but there was a whole bunch of synchronicities and obstacles I had to overcome just to make it happen. We made it happen. I learned a great deal from John. I filmed just about every moment. I mean, when we were sitting down eating, the camera was rolling. When we were on the bus and John was speaking, the camera was rolling. Mm-hmm. It's like it wasn't just at the sites, but it was a lot of the conversation that took place in between. Incredible educational experience for me. I think I took to it pretty quickly because of my esoteric studies, my Rosicrucian studies. It was a little easier for me to grasp the more esoteric concepts that I think it takes others a little longer, John makes the work of R.A. Schwala de Lubitz really palpable and easy to understand. I have no issue reading Schwaller just because I've been so immersed in esotericism. So it really stuck with me, and that trip deeply resonated with me. It echoes with me till this day. And so it took me literally a few years and my mentor, John, as a mentor, didn't even really start until after the trip. It was me calling him up, asking questions and questioning things we saw and reviewing the video, and him giving me books to read and just sending me on this path. And I think he could see the ambition and the passion was there. So he enjoyed it. And then together, I started Ancient Egypt Mystery Schools, which is a private membership site that houses my series, Ancient Egypt Mystery Schools, which features John Anthony West. And he was one of the first members. He was very supportive of that. It was one of the first digital online membership series teaching Egyptian mysteries on the internet. Now there's a lot of different membership sites. It's more common, but this was sort of ahead of its time when it first launched. And so that's ancientegyptmysteryschools.com. I have that as well. And members of Ancient Egypt Mystery Schools get a discount on our tours.
That's awesome. Nice.
Very cool. Does anybody else on the panel have any questions about his business or what he's doing with?
I had a question for you. I'm wondering, since you are at such an ancient site, have you experienced any metaphysical things? Anything? Yeah, I see the smile. You must have had some kind of experience.
And I'm not really one in all transparency, Laurie, I'm not really one to experience these sort of things. I am one who practices meditation daily. I'm a member of the Self-Realization Fellowship. I studied Kriya Pranayama Yoga as it was brought to the West by our beloved Paramahansa Yogananda. And so I am always meditating. I also practice Rosicrucian meditations and vowel sounds. I have found it to be extremely helpful. but I'm not someone that has these experiences and channelings or, getting to that state. I get into some interesting states that I really don't want to express because I feel like it'll dilute the experience, but I'm not one to typically have these experiences. I have seen some strange phenomena in my life. I have seen what I could call a UFO, an unidentified flying object. Whether it's an actual alien or not, I can't tell you. It could be, it could be something else made of man. I don't know. But in Egypt, and actually in the Yucatan as well, and just about all of these sacred sites, there's always strange and curious things that happen. But in terms of feeling the energy or having a really significant, we have many of them. We have on our tours, these things are always happening. They happen to our guests. But for me personally, the big one would have to be in the Chapel of Sekhmet at Karnak, which I think is perhaps the most powerful power spot on the planet, more so than the Sphinx, more so than the pyramids. It is closed to the general public. If you were a tourist and you went to Karnak, you will not get access inside this temple. We have it opened up special permissions for our tours. And it's at the Temple of Ptah, which is in somewhat ruinous, but still well-preserved state. Inside is the small Chapel of Sekhmet. It's a very small space, and there's a little niche in the ceiling which allows light to come in and activate the Numen, activate the statue with the rising sun, which it therefore is able to absorb the power or energy of the sun. And so many are those. I mean, I know grown men who have walked out of the Chapel of Sekhmet in complete tears.
Yeah.
I've been on tours with the non-believers. My tours are very, they're balanced. I like to consider myself a mystic in skeptic's clothing. I approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. I do lean on the academic works, but I'm also very much into the mystical, esoteric, metaphysical aspects. And so, sometimes it's usually the husbands. You'll have the wives who are in the metaphysical, and maybe one of the husbands isn't into it. But I've watched these men come out deeply moved. My first experience, it was on the tour with John Anthony West, and I was filming. I had actually injured myself, my own fault. I was climbing something that I probably shouldn't have been climbing to try to get a better shot, footage. And in the process, I reactivated a previous injury. I had hurt my ribs while in Hawaii. And then when I went to Egypt and I was climbing, I sort of reactivated the injury. And I didn't tell anybody. I want to continue to tour. I didn't want to be, I didn't want to hold anybody back. So, but everyone could see that I was not moving at the same pace and that I was keeping, I wasn't my usual self. I was keeping a little more quiet. I could barely talk. I was hunched over. And so when we got to Karnak early in the morning, before there's any tourists there with the rising sun, the first thing, they all went to the Chapel of Sekhmet. And I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know much about Sekhmet. I had seen the deity. I knew she was the goddess of fire. And that was about it. That was the extent of it. I didn't realize all her many aspects and her deeper esoteric significance. And so I didn't really know what was happening. And I wanted to get footage. And they were all walking a little faster than me. And I said, don't worry, go on without me because I'm not, I wasn't feeling very well with the injury. I said, I'll be okay. Just go without me. And I used the time to film. There are enormous, massive, long rows at Karnak. It is such an expansive temple with all these fascinating artifacts that are just laid out in rows and identified for the archaeologists. And I mean, you could spend the day just looking at these rows, never mind the rest of the temple complex. And I was in there filming, and then I realized, about 20, 30 minutes had passed. I need to get back with the group. I linked up with the group, and I could see tears in people's eyes. I could see people shaken up and moved, and I wanted to know what was going on. And someone showed me a photo, and I could see all these orbs and beams wrapping around Sekhmet. And my first inclination is, okay, maybe it's the camera, maybe it's dust on the camera. I need to go and see it for myself. I need to go to the source and experience it for self. And so one of the people in our tour group took me over there. We got the keeper to unlock and go inside. It's very dark. It's nearly pitch dark unless you open the door and allow the light to come in. Went in there, put the cameras on, sat down, just meditated for a little while. After the meditation, got up, looked around, noticed something. And I wasn't sure at first. It looked like it was out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a spark. looked again, it looked like another one. And the first thing, we could defer to, in the world of psychology, there's a term called pareidolia, I believe, pareidolia. And so that's essentially the basis for facial recognition software, Facebook, and so the way that, for those that may not be familiar with the concept, the things that we see, we're likely to, attribute something that's unfamiliar to something that's familiar. It's like pattern recognition. So the first thing, I thought it was probably like a firefly or some sort of insect. And I was watching, and it was 2, 3, 4. And before I knew it, I'm not going to say it was Kundalini energy, but every hair on my body stood up, and my spine stood up, and I was frozen in awe, suspended in a moment, and just time seemed to stop for a second. And it was boom, 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 1, 2, 3, 4. Then many of these lights swirling around in a circle. I could see it with my eyes, and I wasn't alone. I had a witness experience the same thing. I can tell you firsthand, I'm one of the skeptics. I'm going to try to debunk everything, but I cannot deny this physical experience. I have no reason, nothing to gain. I'm all for truth and transparency. I have a hard time believing in a lot of things that I hear without seeing it, but I experienced firsthand what happened, and it disappeared. This had to happen. I didn't have an exact beat on a time, but it probably happened all within 40 seconds to a minute. That 1, 2, they appear swarming around, and these lights disappear. And then we start taking pictures and footage, not quite getting the extent of the lights, but when we took it out, you could see them again in the footage. Some will try to debunk this as, and could be dust particles. I can't say with certainty. I know that the site is built on a cosmotelluric zone where you have, cosmotelluric forces, engaging with cosmo forces, engaging with telluric forces of the earth. There's usually always water under these sites. So there's certainly a lot that goes into, all the ancient sacred sites were planted,
on water,
on water in very precise locations. And that's why we were talking earlier about how the churches came in and dominated some of the sites that you mentioned earlier. And that happens all over the world. It happens in Mexico. Everywhere you go, when the early missionaries and the Jesuits and the early friars came to these indigenous civilizations, like the Maya and the Mexica, who the academics refer to as the Aztecs, they took notice of a lot of this. And a lot of these Jesuits, there's accounts of Abbe Berme and Jesuits that were using dowsing and dowsing rods, learning indigenous techniques and then using techniques as well to create a situation where there's an influence or a presence over the local indigenous cultures. Look, we have magic. We can take you to the water with our dowsing rods. And so there's been much that has been written about this. Like I said, Abbe Mermet, a lot of the early Jesuits were into dowsing, which is not only looking for water, but different energies. You have the work of like Dr. Karim from Egypt. I believe he's in Canada now, who does the biogeometric signatures using pendulums and dowsing rods to check the biosignatures and energies at a lot of the sites in Egypt. Of course, we have the work of John Burke, the late John Burke, who went around, wrote the book. Actually, I don't have it. I'm not gonna. It's in the back somewhere. But he wrote a remarkable book where he went around with his partner using magnetometers, went to sacred sites all over the world, went on top of pyramids, recording the energies at these sacred sites. So we know they're fused with energetics. And if you get into the ontology, if you get into the mythology of the ancients themselves, they're talking about these different energies. Modern, a lot of people, we look at Hollywood and we see these glyphs on the wall and we refer to them as gods. But they are the Netters, the Neteru of ancient Egypt, which are essentially personifications of natural and cosmic energies. And so it was a way for the ancient Egyptians to express this. It's just like us today, we still struggle to express certain aspects of physics. The ancient Egyptians, the Ptolemaic Egyptians had the same challenges in trying to express that. And I would assume the next best thing for them were to take images of humans and animals and certain characteristics and traits of those animals to try to best express what that energy is representing. And that's where looking at Egypt under an esoteric lens becomes more, creates a more unique dynamic, bringing a whole new dimension to the experience of visiting these sacred sites. When you have a little bit of context and you have a different way of looking at something, it literally opens up a whole new world. I never get bored. I'm always excited to go back to the next trip, and I'm always evolving as a person and learning, but there's just so much, and to go back and keep looking at it with a new, fresh set of eyes, it never gets old.
Yeah, sounds like it. I know Mandy had some questions, and Dalibor has a couple lined up for you.
Well, I have a question. Since you've been to a couple of these ancient sites, like notably the Pyramid of Senefru, Turkey, and the Yucatan, by all accounts, the Pyramid of Senefru was intentionally covered up with stones. They filled in the passages with stones, at least according to that Italian explorer that first discovered it. The same thing holds true for Göbekli Tepe, where that huge pyramid complex was intentionally covered up 13,000 years ago with stones. Same thing goes for the pyramid complex at Hawara. Have you noticed that same pattern of a structure being intentionally preserved by having it covered up with stone anywhere else?
Oh, I'm sure there's certain sites. I'm not calling anything to mind immediately. I mean, you mentioned the top smoking guns, which would be Göbekli Tepe, which was intentionally covered up. And obviously the bent pyramid had the stones inside. Between the two, the difference is with the bent pyramid, we find the stones inside the pyramid, blocking the passages. Whereas with Göbekli Tepe, the entire complex was covered over. And that's really not all that unusual. Sites are getting covered over. I mean, for natural causes, of course, windblown sand. We just had a remarkable discovery. It broke the news yesterday and today. In fact, before this show, I just wrapped up a video on the new discovery of the so-called lost city of gold in Luxor in Egypt, which is making big news. It'll be on all mainstream media tonight. Once I finish with this show, I'm going to upload the video and get the thumbnail up and out. So just a short, it's just a short video. There's already a few YouTubers that have already covered this, such as Matt at Ancient Architects and Chuck at the CFAPS YouTube channel. They both put up videos today covering this. But what we've only seen so far are press photos. I have someone on the ground from my team, my Adept Expeditions team in Egypt at the site today. And we actually captured footage live today of the site before all of the mainstream media bring in their cameras. It's going to be a big event. Awesome. And so this is never before seen footage of this newly excavated site. They just started working on it in September of last year. But to answer your question, I'm not off the top of my head, no, but I know in my studies.
I have an answer. I actually have an answer for it, or what I would think, only because everybody knows my background, and I actually specialize in catastrophic geology in that field because I've been prospecting professionally and doing that for so many years and follow a lot of the works. But Anyextee, what they found, I think, was that if you look at the dating of Göbekli Tepe and the structures that were purposely buried by rock layers and preserved, they were done that for a reason, because they all align with the clock event of that geologic period that happens like clockwork every 12,068 years exactly within, if you look at the Daiho Foundation and all
theory
the behind it. So this is why some of the structures, especially that period, certain periods were recovered into preserve for people to find at a later date. Because if they weren't, then they would have been destroyed. So I believe that's probably why they were covered in.
That is one valid theory that is gaining popularity. I know a lot of people suspect that Göbekli Tepe may go back even further, right? We have the carbon dating, but we don't know for certain when that started. And it's possible, some think, that it could go back before the Younger Dryas, before this potential cataclysmic event that took place, at the end or at the end of the last ice age. And so there's many that believe that they may have been intentionally covered up to preserve the site from these cataclysmic disasters, especially in Turkey, where you find a lot of these underground caverns and places where people went underground.
That's
However,
Cappadocia.
I think they're dated around the same period, actually. In the period when the people went to the caverns in Turkey by Göbekli Tepe when they were covered, and I think they did do an exodus into the caverns, and I think it was around the same time, actually.
Yeah, well, there's a big span in Turkey, and what we're going to be seeing is a lot more discoveries coming out of Turkey. I know there's more happening right now that they're actually being kind of quiet about, but the whole, when you fly in to go to Göbekli Tepe, you go to the Şanlıurfa airport, and all of the modern day city of Şanlıurfa is on top of ancient ground. These people below their homes, they're always digging up archaeological sites that have, been there preserved on top. This is a very, very old part of and it's very likely, it's possible that a lot of pre-dynastic Egypt is potentially influenced from that area, that they may have trickled down into Egypt. But to go along with that argument, because I always like to look at all sides, I have a hard time concluding on anything. I usually try to slow myself before I come to a hard, firm conclusion. Unless I was there, it's hard to say without absolute proof. Sekhmet, I was there. I know what I saw. But with ancient, the ancient civilizations, it's difficult to digest sometimes. There is another good case to be made for ritual cover-ups. My mentor, John Anthony West, was of the opinion that Göbekli Tepe was potentially ritually covered up. And what I mean by that is not necessarily to protect it from an oncoming cataclysmic event, which it would seem that the ancients had an understanding of these cycles of times and may have known about that. But the other aspect is just for ritual and spiritual purposes. So, for example, in Mexico, the Maya are building pyramid on top of pyramid on top of pyramid, covering up the older pyramid. I've had the rare opportunity to go inside of the pyramid of Kukulkan, in the academic world, or by the Spanish name El Castillo, which is the name, El Castillo is the name that the Spanish gave to the pyramid, which is consecrated to the principle of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, major tourist attraction. And so a lot of people don't realize that that's actually 3 pyramids. What we see when we see that iconic step pyramid is just the exterior. Inside are 2 more pyramids, and we haven't even seen the innermost pyramid yet. We only know about it from we know about it from the non-invasive technology such as tomography that can take a readout of the inside. But we do know about the inner pyramid. It was in the 1950s that archaeologists started to burrow into the southern side. It started to collapse. Then they moved around to the northern side and created a stairwell going up and on top of the second pyramid, where they found inside completely intact a chamber, what they call the sacrificial chamber, or the chamber of offerings. There's a Chakmul statue and other very interesting aspects. I did a video on this, which is on YouTube. It's actually one of the only videos on YouTube that you can see the inside of the pyramid of Kukulkan. You can see a close-up of the holes that they have in the walls where there's actual bones.
I saw that.
Human finger bones inside. And so that was a way of taking, my wife explains it really well. My wife is indigenous, by the way. She's of Mexica descent. Mexica is what a lot of people know as Aztecs. Aztec is the academic and what the Spanish started to refer to the people as Aztecs. The people themselves refer to themselves as the Mexica, from which we get the word Mexico, Mexico. My wife is Mexica from that area. She explains the bones really well and why it was important for her tradition. In addition to that, R.A. Schwala de Lubitz, this is very esoteric occult, talks about the femur bone and how the red corpuscles, which is essentially helps the blood and nourish the blood, it gives us life, are in these bones. That's why there's such an importance on the femur bone, and the cross bones we see often attributed with so-called secret societies and fraternities. And much of the Western esoteric world derives its concepts from the indigenous traditions. It can all be rooted in shamanism. It was the ancient shamans who had this ontology and way of connecting with the other world and transcending over. And these were the ideas that were venerated and respected. These were the only people that were allowed on top of the pyramids. It was the priests and which were shaman of their day. These people eventually become the medicine men, which eventually get labeled witch doctors, and then we separate everything today and we have different categories. But back then it was really a sacred science. It was art, religion, spirituality, metaphysics, all merged into one and all venerated at each of these pyramids. So what I want to say is we do have to take into consideration this concept of ritually building over, and we know at Chichen Itza there was an older Maya culture there, and then the Toltec tradition comes from central Mexico, essentially sort of like Mexicas and the Toltec tradition, and they fused with the Maya, which at the time was the Itza Maya. You have many different Maya people, and the Itza Maya that occupied that area fused with the Toltecs. And that's the pyramid we see today. It's actually Toltec design. Everyone's like, this is an amazing Maya pyramid, and the, all the math and geometry and the calendrics that are encoded into the pyramid. Well, that's all. It all comes from the Toltec school of the Tolteca tradition, fusing with the Maya in that area. And so it was a way also to ritually build on top of older structures, often expanding them and making them bigger, as if representing the cosmology of a seed, one seed growing out and expanding. Same thing we find in Egypt with the temples. That starts in the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the temple, and then it expands all the way out. It's a way of expressing the ontology of the ancients, that cosmology from the source outward. And then there's also these different traditions that come in and fuse. And so each time marks a new rule, a new decommissioning the old, right? And also potentially decommissioning the magic. And when I say magic, I'm talking about the sympathetic magic of that site as a way to bring in the new. And it could have very well been timed with events, just like we think that Göbekli Tepe may be timed with an oncoming cataclysm. There's smaller cycles, right, where we know it's not necessarily cataclysmic. Like among the Maya, every 52 years is a cycle, the Venus transits. And they represented these things by building new markers and new structures on top of older structures. So it's hard to say, was it definitely because of a cataclysm? Could be. Or did it have another purpose? But whatever the case is, we do know it was ritually done. We do know it, not necessarily ritually done, but we know that it was a tradition that was carried out around the world, be it in Turkey, or building over sites in Egypt, building over sites in Mesoamerica, and what have you.
Or what about Bosnia? What are your thoughts on the Bosnian pyramid? From all the indications, it seems to be an actual pyramid that was constructed in a similar manner to the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan, where the inner core is rubble and you have an outer shell of concrete. Because based on the research of Samir Osmanagic, it seems to be the Pyramid of the Sun in Bosnia seems to be actual concrete. That's like an outer shell for a pyramid that has internal structures similar to the ones that we see in the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And that's a good question. As far as my take on the Bosnian pyramid, it's another inconclusive situation. And the reason for that, I haven't been. And I feel like I have to be there in person. I've looked into his research. I've looked at everything that's been, documented about the site. But on the other hand, Dr. Robert Schock, who was a colleague of my mentor, John Anthony West, went there on site, and he's a geologist. He's the geologist that we look at for the redating of the Sphinx, and he doesn't believe that it's a man-made pyramid. He doesn't believe that it is what it is being perpetuated as. As a geologist, I have to give consideration. I'm not a geologist. I'm a layman. But as a geologist, as Schock being a geologist, I have to defer to Dr. Robert Schock on this and his eye for the stone. I can't say with certainty. So, it's really Schock's opinion versus the original work. I don't want to say anything for myself until I've actually been there. I've seen video, I've seen pictures, and I can see the argument on both sides. It may be a pyramid, it may not be. I wouldn't want to comment until I've had the opportunity to go there. I will eventually go there. It's on the bucket list. But until then, I couldn't say with certainty.
Excuse me just a second. Mandy, you've been you're on mute, just so you know. But you had a couple questions for next.
Sorry, I know I missed out on a little bit. I'm just curious on what timeline do they believe that these sites were covered in Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah, so Göbekli Tepe goes back what? Why am I drawing a blank? We're going back 12,000, 10 to 12,000. The radiocarbon dating, I think the earliest of the carbon dating is like 9,000 years. But yeah, it goes back at least 12,000 years. So that being said, when it's a great question that you asked, Mandy. Again, I don't know. I wasn't there. But when was it actually covered up? We have the dating of the stone from inside, the organic matter that was inside underneath the burial. When exactly did it get buried up? I'm not certain. I'm not sure anybody is, if anyone can confirm with certainty at this point.
They believe that Göbekli Tepe links to Easter Island. Is that correct?
I couldn't say, but I would say that all these ancient sites are linked in the respect that they all appear to be remnants of the same primordial tradition, which is the primordial tradition that we speak about in the Western esoteric tradition, from which we get alchemy, Hermeticism, Gnosticism. All of these things go back to this ancient primordial tradition. And eventually the source, when you trace it all the way back, it's all remnants of the source. It's all examples of the source of experiencing itself. In that respect, I would say at a metaphysical level, they are all linked. But whether there's a direct connection between cultures, between Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island, I can't say with certainty. But what I can say is that those statues are eerily reminiscent. When you see I have I'm wearing the shirt now, and these guys look like the Easter Island, and as well as the hand gesture. We often see the hand gesture by the omphalos, by the navel, by the belly button. And so when you see that and you see the elongated statues, there does seem to be some similarities, as well as script. I believe that it's not my area of interest. I love Easter Island. It's not my specialty per se, but I know Dr. Robert Schock and his wife Katie more so, I believe, has done extensive work on the Rangu Rangu script of Easter Island, and they've demonstrated in the symbolism how there's actually a connection. There are links symbolically expressing what may be the same thing between Göbekli Tepe and Easter Island and other places around the world.
Like Mohenjo-Daro, the similarity of the script is actually to Mohenjo-Daro, which is in Pakistan.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to ask, because there's folks talking about it in the chat room. It's on just about every show whenever we talk about Egypt. And I've got Scotty Roberts coming on at the end of the month to talk about his research in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. So I got to ask you next, with all the experience you've had at looking at all these hieroglyphs and looking at some of the places you've been, what's your take on the interpretation of some of these glyphs as representing giants?
Yes, so the giant thing. I will say that I have looked into the whole giant phenomena, and I'm not a huge proponent of it because I do feel that in more cases than not, there's just too many loose ends. There's a lot of good reasons to suspect hoax. For example, I went and investigated the so-called evidence for giants at Lovelock Cave. My wife and I went there, and I'm going to do a video on this, so we'll go into more detail. But I concluded that it's not. Even when we talked to the local Paiute, and the whole way that giants were perpetuated in their tradition wasn't really part of their tradition. It sort of has been twisted by people with different agendas. There are people that were trying to bring attention to the sites and gain funding, so they would write the stories in different ways to try to get attention, and that happens quite often. I'm not going to say that large people, that there haven't been giants. There's certainly been anomalies on this planet. There's people that are extraordinarily large and extraordinarily short. With respect to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, we often see images of one really tall character and one really short figure. And more often than not, when someone thinks that it's a giant, they lack the appropriate context for the hieroglyphs and what has been established in academia. And of course, they'll say all the academics are crazy and all Egyptologists are it's a big joke. That's not the case. Yes, Egyptology certainly needs help in a lot of areas. Egyptology is not an exact science, but I have spent endless hours, entire weekends reading boring academic literature. I much rather be reading the alternative books, which are far more exciting to read, but the boring academic literature does hold a lot of value and information in there. And when you actually study the hieroglyphs and the mythology and the ontology of the ancients, what it's depicting in just about every case where you see one figure larger, it was a way for them to emphasize who was buried, whose tomb. Often you'll see the large figure juxtaposed against a smaller figure in a tomb. We see examples of this when we go on tour. Saqqara, one of the first tombs we have, I point this out. The large figure is usually who is buried in the tomb, and it was just basically a way of emphasizing the importance, the significance of that person. Another example, we see the giant with the so-called Dendera light bulb. beneath the inside the subterranean crypts below the Temple of Hathor in Egypt. I just did a video on this. In fact, a very esoteric video.
Yeah, it was a good video.
Yeah, I saw it.
You guys
Very
saw that?
good. Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of demonstrate and point out the Hermetic principles and how the 7 Hermetic principles are established in the relief. But as I explained in the video, I explained who the figures are. It's essentially not even Har Sumptis, but it is an aspect of Har Sumptis, which is a Greek corruption of the Egyptian Har Semetawi, a deity or god, or best viewed as a netter, a principle or aspect of nature and cosmology. This figure is an aspect of Har Sumptis. And the serpent we see inside the filament in the tube, the so-called light bulb, is also an aspect of Har Sumptis. It's actually, it's Har Sumptis, it's the creator, it's source expressing itself, just like it's doing here with, all is it 8 of us, all 8 of us. We're all merely an extension of the same source. We look and feel like individuals. Our material body is here, but essentially we are all emanations of a single source is experiencing itself through us in the same way that it's represented in this relief, expressing the principle of duality. But a lot of people without the appropriate context will look at that and see a giant and assume, oh, this is a good case for giants in Egypt. This is not good evidence for giants in Egypt. There's better evidence for giants in Egypt. I've seen extremely large sarcophaguses, and there's unusual bones.
Can I just say, just what you're saying, I think is just so I'm clear, I think, and it makes sense actually, just the simplest answer is that possibly the size of the pictures, the depiction just has to do with their importance in society. So you would have the pharaoh being the largest image in the picture to denote his station in, the whole region. And then from down there, you got the lower people and the slaves. And so it's just a natural depiction of importance or class.
That is a way of looking at it. It's not always going to be a pharaoh. Sometimes it could be
just important. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Just their importance or class or status within the community. To that would they indicate their size indicates I'm just saying the simplistic answer that I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Simple, I mean,
rather than hear my 15-minute blah blah blah, that's the shortest.
No. I'm just saying it. That's what I thought of when you said it, not the way you were explaining it. Just when you were saying about the tombs and how you were laying them out. It just even depicting just the importance of their position would indicate the size of their picture.
Yeah, like their statuary. Go ahead, Jules. Did you
look at some of those countries where you got the dictators and they got those huge pictures of themselves pasted all over the place, but they're gigantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jules, you wanted to say something, Jules?
Yes. As I look at the word, we have any at the beginning of it, and that's born of that phallic symbol. Born. Any is born of.
Okay.
Interesting.
Also, don't forget that there's the papyrus of Ani, which is also a historical Egyptian document, and I also see a similarity in words between, for example, you mentioned Harasekmet. That sounds like Harasalem, and Harasalem is the origin of the word for Jerusalem, which means mountain of peace in Hebrew. But I'm also seeing other similarities, interesting similarities, like, for example, Shakmul. That's a very common deity, very common icon in Central America. But it sounds, if you just take the syllables, it sounds like Sekhmet almost, even though they're completely different. Like Sekhmet is feminine and gentle, whereas Shakmul is like death, basically.
Polarity.
Have you noticed any other like word similarities like that? For example, another interesting one is in my native language, which is Czech. The word for bird is ptak, P-T-A-K, and in Egypt you have a bird-headed deity named Ptah, which just defies explanation.
Yeah, I don't really specialize in the etymology or the word similarities, but I know there's a lot out there, and I know there's a lot of researchers that focus in this area. Off top, I like to give consideration to the site of Ekbalam in the Yucatan. Popular site in the Yucatan, but still somewhat lesser known. Ekbalam could potentially mean star jaguar or black jaguar. Balam is jaguar in Maya. Ek could be either a star, so star jaguar, or dirt or soil, the rich alluvial soil. And what's interesting is we find similar in ancient Egypt, which was not known as Egypt, which was known as Kemet, which was for the black land, the alluvial rich soil, which was deposited by the Nile. You had, Egypt was the two lands. You had Kemet, which was the dark soil, and you had Deshret, which was the desert. You had the desert and then along the Nile. And so you have Kemet, right, which is Kemet, which was for the soil, for the dark soil, and then you have Ek, which is for the dark soil in among the Maya. And so, what's interesting actually at Ekbalam, there's many similarities, not so much in the language, and there are, off the top of my head, I can't think of it, but I know in my research there's so many Maya words that I look at and I'm like, oh, this could fit with ancient Egyptian. And who does a remarkable job with this, by the way, you should have him on your show if you have an opportunity, is Laird Scranton. He's a cosmologist, and he's done extensive work with finding the root clusters, the root of words, and drawing those similarities between different traditions all around the world, going back to antiquity. I focus more on the archaeology and the symbolism as opposed to the etymology and the words, the linguistics. But in reading and research, I've come across it many times. I know there's, it seems as though everything goes back to a root.
Do you feel that the Sphinx enclosure in Egypt is older than the Great Pyramid, or that that it's older than the pyramids in general? Because when I went there, I saw the classical megalithic marshmallow stones, which are common in all over the world. Like, and they're usually like the oldest building stones. Like, for example, at Baalbek, where you have the megalithic, those huge stones, and then you have like the Canaanite temple, and then the temple of Jupiter that the Romans built above that. It's always the oldest stones are always like these marshmallow stones. So based on that, would you surmise that the enclosure for the Sphinx is actually could it be older than the Sphinx itself?
I think there is a good argument for that. I'm obviously a proponent of that, as was my mentor, John Anthony West. In academia, obviously, that's not the case. So the usual explanation is that the Great Pyramid came first, and then you had the second pyramid, which was consecrated to Khafra, who is attributed to the Sphinx Valley Temple and the Sphinx Ditch. And so, they see it as all happening in the Old Kingdom during the time of the pyramids, after even the Great Pyramid. However, with the evidence, when we look at everything with respect to all of the evidence with respect to the Sphinx enclosure, there is a good case to be made for not only the enclosure itself, but the Sphinx, which had to be carved out of the enclosure, right? At first, it was probably a Yardang, which was probably in the shape, gave them the inspiration to make the head. But the body had to be dug out. They had to excavate around the body, creating that ditch that you're talking about now. And so when we look at the water erosion in the work of John Anthony West and Dr. Robert Schoch, as well as many others, there is a good case to be made for the Sphinx and the Sphinx Ditch going way back in time. And if we take the account of the ancient Egyptians themselves, for example, when we look at the Turin Papyrus and the Palermo stone, or the works of Manetho. Manetho was a Greek historian living in Egypt around the time when the Greek interlopers were coming into Egypt. And he had access, he was there in the Ptolemaic times, and he had to establish the timeline for the Ptolemies, for the Greek kings. And he put together his idea of a timeline. And it's radically different from, it sets everything back at least a couple thousand years than what the usual academic timeline says today. If we look at Manetho's work, it would be the Egyptian civilization is supposed to have started or began around 32 to 34,000 BC, depending which historians you talk to. According to Manetho, that was actually the second unification. The academics look at what's called the unification of the two lands, the unifying of King Narmer, also known as Menes, from which we get the word Menahouse. Menahouse is the hotel that we usually stay at across the street from the pyramids. But this was actually, according to Manetho, and he had access to all of the libraries at that time and the scrolls. And so according to him, that was the second unification. And there's just so much evidence that goes ignored or overlooked. For example, talking about ancient lost technology, when we look at the vases, the vessels that are on display in the Egyptian Museum, or the stuff that came out of the excavation underneath the Djoser Pyramid at Saqqara, these things are so finely made. They're so precise, and it's just the schist disc, a complete mystery, right? And so we have these out of place artifacts, but we have also these vessels that go back to the early stages of Egyptian history. And then even before that, prehistory and very early dynasties, we had the bone tags that were found in the various tombs. I talked about this in my comprehensive video on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure, entitled "The Sphinx Explained," which you can find on my YouTube channel. It's a documentary on this. Yeah, and so I am of the opinion that the Sphinx is much older than the academics say. And with that being said, the enclosure itself goes further back. When you talk about the molded stone, I'm curious though, are you suggesting that perhaps it was like a geopolymer or a soft stone?
I don't know. I personally don't really have an opinion on that, but the geopolymer theory seems kind of interesting. Although, in my opinion, it could also have been a stylistic thing. That it could have been like, their cachet or their brand of, okay, we make the stones like this because we're better than all these other people, or something like that. Because it takes extra effort to make the stone in that shape. It's much easier to just use a copper saw and sand and make straight cuts. But that requires a lot of extra effort. And then to make that molding around it that's perfectly rectangular, with the protruding marshmallow shape, that's extra workmanship. That takes a lot of time, even if you're using something like sandstone.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And we know that, the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, and most of the ancients didn't do anything haphazardly. It was all done with intent, The pyramids themselves, we know, between the form, the orientation, as I mentioned earlier about, these sites being sacred because of the energetics that are demonstrated to be at the sites, not just through speculation and ideas about metaphysics and esoteric ideas, but actual hard science. Again, Robert Burke went around and tested these sites, and they show significant, he returned significant data where actually he brought the magnetometers to some of the pyramids, some of the Maya pyramids, and local farmers would bring their seeds to the top of the pyramid, and the demonstrations, they did the testing where the seeds that were placed on top of the pyramids yielded far better results than those that were not. And so there's a good case to be made for the energy that's there. And so the ancient Egyptians, they knew what they were doing. They knew where they wanted to put this stuff, why they wanted to put it, and nothing. When we see these sort of inexactitudes, they're not mistakes, they're not errors. They often have a metaphysical meaning, or a meaning that's tied into their cosmology, ontology, or way of viewing the world and the world around us.
Yeah, that this goes down to the fine detail observed in the 40s, where they discovered that the Great Pyramid actually has 8 sides, which is something you can only observe from the air, and only during a certain angle of the sun, where it's actually got 2 sides that are perfectly symmetrical. And in my opinion, that must have required some advanced technology. Same with inside the Great Pyramid, there's definite evidence of machining, because it's very easy using, for example, copper saws and sand to make exterior cuts that are perpendicular. But to make those same cuts on the inside, that requires some kind of a machine. Because when I felt the inside, it's smooth to the very corners. And you can't polish stone like that.
It's amazing. It's like the polished granite boxes, which they believe are sarcophagus for the Apis bull at Saqqara in the Serapeum, or the Serapeum as well. Same thing. And when we actually see the smoking gun for the lost technology, one of the big smoking guns we show on our tours inside the now old Cairo Egyptian Museum. There's a coffer there, and it's often passed over by the casual tourist. You really need to go with someone who knows this stuff and knows where, how to find it, how to point out. You have to walk around the back of it. It's sort of hidden in a corner, and we usually get the whole group to come and squeeze through the corner just to look at this. But it is extremely precise. It looks like as if some saw blade went through the stone and reared off. In fact, I'm going to be doing a video on this in the near future on my YouTube channel. But there's there's so much evidence for lost technology and what we would call advanced machining. Whether it was an actual hard machine in the way that we conceive it today, that remains to be seen. But certainly there is a lost technique. Perhaps it was something more natural, something that's right under our nose, something that we're missing or just can't perceive. I personally tend to think that we're not going to get the answer to a lot of these. In fact, I believe this is one of my more firm beliefs. We may find some answers and reveal some mysteries in our lifetime, but the vast majority of understanding that we lack, that the ancients had, we're not going to get for quite some time until the cycles go around and the Yuga cycles come back to that sort of golden age. Many mystics, Paramahansa Yogananda, has talked about how things will be different in the future. Or when we look at the Kali Yugas or these long cycles of time, there are also cycles or waves of consciousness. We can see where people were doing remarkable things that, was accomplished by humans. I don't want to say in a higher state of consciousness, but in a clearer state of consciousness that we seem to lack today. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? It can't all be just conditioning and programming of our modern society. There has to be something greater at play. And that's where I feel like celestial events, whether it's the stars or planets or positions of things in the sky that we know have an effect. I mean, we know the moon affects water. We're mostly comprised of water. Astrology is based on the principles of the way that these, off-world principles affect human activity and human consciousness. And so I think it may have something to do with that, whereas in the future, we will return to our understanding. Maybe we'll realize it was all done with, some water and acoustics and something that we're just not looking at today. We're able to do this. Maybe it wasn't hard machines and saws. Maybe there's something natural and organic to it, a soft technology. But whatever the case is, there's a lost techniques that were applied that we just can't explain, that the academics themselves cannot explain.
The other interesting similarity between Egypt and South America is the presence of cocaine inside the wrappings of the mummies. And the other interesting similarity would be the fact that both the Inca Empire and the Egyptian Empire were pretty much one-dimensional empires that went along a very narrow path, like specifically the Nile River, which is just a narrow path. And if you've ever you've flown over Egypt, and you see that it's basically all desert, except for that really narrow band of the Nile River. Same thing in the Inca Empire, where you have a very narrow band going also north to south along the west side of the Andes Mountains. So those would be two similarities. But with the cocaine, that would indicate to me, since the coca plant only grows in South America, that there must have been a global civilization and global trade going on that facilitated this material getting to Egypt.
Yeah, it's the whole, the idea of cultural diffusionism. It's something that's frowned upon in the academic world. The academics insist that all these things started independently in different cultures. And there are some good arguments for that. I'm not going to deny that. I've looked over those, and there's a lot of validity. Skip that word.
Yeah.
Validity.
Some validity. Yeah.
Some validity to that. But on the other hand, I see far more evidence for cross-cultural, connections. I mean, it's all over the world. Take Egypt again in the Maya. I was mentioned Ekbalam. At Ekbalam, if you look at it from an aerial view, they have these little stone structures which were essentially steam bats, and they were positioned right in front of the Acropolis, right in front of this major pyramidal structure which towers the Yucatan, well over the dense vegetation. When we do our tours there, it's absolutely remarkable. You climb up to the top, you look around, a full 360 view of nothing but jungle. And in that jungle, you see all these mounds and bumps that are pyramids and unexcavated structures. Mm-hmm. But right below, they have this structure that's a steam bath. It's in the shape of an Egyptian Ankh, the key to life. So when we look at it from above, it's the same shape. And there's actually so many similarities. I mean, even in the mythology, you could compare Osiris to Hunahpu of Maya tradition. They're essentially, these different cultures had understood the same universal principles and cosmic laws and just gave them different names and personifications. And that seems to be the case all over. But at the same time, we also find literal evidence of artifacts you have potential Maya artifacts in America. You have, like you mentioned, the cocaine that has been discovered. There's so many different examples. There's one I can't call to mind. One of the fruits, which there's some produce that traveled as well. I'm drawing a blank, but I know there's a lot of instances where we see this cultural fusion, and clearly, when you're building pyramids with calendrics and you're encoding the metaphysical makeup of man in the structure, you're building these mystery schools. It's not going to be that challenging to build, a vessel that can take you across the ocean. It's been demonstrated. People like Thor, we have so many examples of people doing it today. I don't see any reason why. Even when we mentioned the Bent Pyramid, you have this wood that was discovered inside the Bent Pyramid, which is very likely the cedars of Lebanon. They were carving boats out of the cedars of Lebanon. Was it ocean worthy? I can't say, but we know it was seaworthy. They were at least taking these boats into the Red Sea. So they had the concept of navigating and seafaring. I don't see, people had to travel. And in addition to that, we know that over time, the landmass has likely changed. It was likely probably one big continent that has shifted over time. And then you have remnants spread out that are carrying the same ideas that stem from what I mentioned earlier, the primordial tradition.
Yep. Well, Anyextee, we're already over by about 20 minutes. I'm sorry. No. It's just
I thought we were just getting started.
I have two people that might have a question here. I just need to check real quick. And Trina, did you have a question on your mind? It looked like there for a second you might have something you wanted to say.
Yeah, could you define the primordial part of this? What is the primordial part of this?
So from an esoteric perspective, and the phrase primordial tradition goes back to the Renaissance. Renaissance being when they started to rediscover the ways of the ancients. This was happening in Rome, and at this time also Europeans were now making contact with Arabs who had occupied Egypt and taken over Egypt at that time, who were still carrying the tradition of some of the people before them, the cultures before them, the Greeks that were there, the Persians and the ancient Egyptians. The whole Western esoteric tradition filters, a lot of it comes out of really all over, but it comes out of Egypt and by way of the Arabs into the European world. And so during the Renaissance, the term is where we first find the term primordial tradition, but it refers to the ancient tradition, which we're referring to, which everything is connected to. But then at a deeper level, when we look at it from an esoteric perspective, it's not even necessarily this one physical tradition of man that occupied the planet, but it is the primordial tradition going back to the time before time. It's a way of understanding our origins. This, of course, would require a whole... Yeah.
What is the primordial tradition? What is it? Is there a definition for it? I mean, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's an official definition if we look it up in the dictionary. But the way that I would define it is that tradition, the West, essentially, it's another word for the Western esoteric tradition, with the limitation that the Western esotericism is relatively new. It's a concept that we have. Primordial tradition being anything that relates to the primordial. If we look at the Egyptian mythology,
they called it the Zeptepi.
Zeptepi, the primordial. They have the primordial mound, which is the ancient Egyptians had this way of viewing nothingness into somethingness, right? A way of taking spirit into matter, of manifesting the unseen with the seen.
My questions. This is where the question's kind of going from, is because the more I keep hearing about all of this, it seems like this tradition was about some type of harnessing power. And I wonder if it was about blood, and if something about sacrificing these thousands and thousands of people energized these pyramids and activated certain specific magical elemental powers. And this is why is this what this primordial tradition was about? Because you look at the femur bone, that's the largest bone in the body to hold the most stem cells, the most potential for healing, regeneration.
Right.
That's in the femur bone. So when you look at this scientifically, these are specific medical benefits that you can get from eating parts of these people, just like adrenochrome. You're looking at primordial. Is this about blood? Is this about the gods harvesting and harnessing people and using the power of the soul? Just like in the Bible, it talks about Abel's blood cried out from the soil. This means that there's a connection between our blood and clay. And if these things are being processed and made out of human bone and blood, they must have power.
Interesting.
And interesting, Trina, that would match up with the finding of course, the material and the bones throughout history and all kinds of structures, old structures where they used bones in certain configurations for frequency and vibration, and as well.
This is the element needed for the seeding, because this is the fertilizer. What do we put in our plants? Blood and bone. That's fertilizer, blood and bone. So I'm just seeing all these correlations, and I'm like, wow, is this what the primordial tradition was?
We just had a guest on 2 nights ago from Australia who was talking about a 50,000-year-old story handed down through the ancestors about creation and about blood.
Wow.
That the blood filled the earth instead of a deluge, and then the blood, the salt, became the water. So that goes back 50,000 years of storytelling about their creation story.
I keep seeing it. I'm like, is this the magical ingredient that made those pyramids operate? Was it actually our blood?
But amber,
Go ahead,
from
next.
The tree.
Yep.
Amber from the tree is resin, which is what's in our blood, which is amber, which is blood. That's
Fire.
The whole resin from the tree. That's
the spark. That's where electron gets its word from, is rubbing of that amber. It comes
And
back.
think
to
about it.
nature.
They'd put the fire in the belly of the bull, and they would throw the children in there. So there you're looking at your fire, your tree, your blood, and gold. Wow. Gold.
But
What do you think of that next?
I think a lot of the structures were sung into place. It's a tonal thing. It's all sound.
So
Yes.
I don't want to misrepresent the primordial tradition in stating that the primordial tradition is essentially also what esotericists would call the perennial wisdom tradition. And it's a way of looking at religious ideas and metaphysical ideas and their history, as well as, looking at the tradition of the cultural phenomena which is associated with that has taken place. So I would say the blood and sacrifice may be an aspect of that. It's not necessarily, the Western esoteric tradition, primordial tradition isn't built on blood sacrifice. And unfortunately, it gets a bad rap. A lot of people, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons and blood sacrifice. And when you when I was younger, I used to assume some of these things, but when you really dig into the history of these organizations, that's not always the case. That's not to say that there aren't, organizations out there that carry these sort of ideas or utilize them. But when you look at the roots, when you look at the indigenous traditions, there is something to be said for that. And I think it is a great misunderstanding. We often take the view of the Spanish apologists and the Spanish Europeans that went into Mexico and invaded and essentially oppressed. I mean, they pillaged and raped and conquered and destroyed the Mexica people, the Maya people. They indoctrinated their youth. They cut the kids off from the parents. They took away the sons and daughters of the shaman, put them in their own schools to teach them religion. That being said, those people did have an interesting connection to sacrifice. When we look at the Maya, the oldest examples of the Maya, we don't see much human sacrifice, actually. It doesn't start, and there's still a lot of controversy among historians and scholars when it comes to the Maya and sacrifice. A lot of the blood sacrifice, human sacrifice comes human sacrifice. They've always been into bloodletting, but that's ritual bloodletting of animals and perhaps even self-sacrifice. Sacrificing other humans is something that came later with the Toltec and Aztec Mexica tradition when they fused. But and clearly it's all built around this idea of sacrifice. If we look at my wife sort of predicted this whole pandemic before it happened. She made a post on Facebook in like December of 2019, stating how this was going to be in 2020 was going to be a very important year for us in terms of sacrifice, and a lot of blood will be shed. What that meant, we didn't know exactly. How she knows this, she did it by essentially reading the Aztec Mexica calendar. She has all the day signs, which can be used. It's astrology. It's early astrology, and it can be used to essentially as a daily manual. The Maya had something similar with their calendar, and it shows us how to live our lives on a daily basis, how to interact, right? And so we knew that something. Yes.
Hey, just a minute. It's interesting. You would mention, your wife mentioned about predicting the pandemic for 2020, and you just talking about the spiritual sacrificing and blood and the people required to make some kind of big movement and change in a cyclical event. Well, it's interesting. What pops into mind about the pandemic is the thousands and thousands that are being sacrificed to the virus at the same time. Right. In this cycle event of the 2020 and the calendar of December 21st, 2020 into the new age and the moving of the clock and the shattered reality that we've all gone into. So you've just basically said there, to me, there's always a sacrifice, no matter on this world, whether it's going to be, back in time, in the ancient times, however they did it, or during the wars that we have decided to do, world war, or in the modern time today of a virus that we have created to sacrifice that what's needed for this, whatever happens on this plane of existence. So
I would contend that the modern tradition is based on blood sacrifice, human sacrifice specifically, because the religions of old have mutated into the governments of today, where in the past 200 years, nobody has killed more humans than governments. And, by that measure, you could say that the shores of Normandy are sacred, hallowed ground. From all the bloodshed that's happened there. If anything, government is the equivalent of modern religion, and Corona, the Corona goddess or god, is just one of them.
Right.
It's just one god.
I don't think we ever really change in our the way we do things in any great scale of over, no matter how many millions or years we think we've existed. I think we play the same scripts and programs, and there's not much variation between them. That's all I know.
That's what I keep seeing. It's like, we've always been taught to sacrifice, and people do horrible things sacrificing to their gods. I wonder if it's now about time to start to really honor and protect life. And that's going to be the change that humanity needs, is to literally honor every single drop of blood and every single human, every animal. We need to start honoring these things instead of sacrificing and killing for our benefits and pleasure. We need to start honoring and protecting.
Yeah, there's something to be said about sacrifice, because it's often connected to the malicious aspect of sacrifice. But as you mentioned, sacrifice is something that we all have to do. I'm sure everyone here has sacrificed something to some extent with this whole pandemic, whether it's been sacrificing the quality of life or your daily routine or whatever it is. You've likely had to, it's shaken some of us up a bit, right? And so I know I had to go through many sacrifices as a result of the pandemic. And with that, there's an aspect to that as well, because it's not always just about the murdering or killing of another human. For the Maya, it's quite likely that it was very honorable and noble to be sacrificed. It seems as though some of the early Maya may have had this view that their ontology was indeed a parallel to what we understand in the Western esoteric tradition, that we are all connected, that we are all an extension of Source. So therefore, for them, it was an honor to give life, forget the life aspect, but to give the blood as a way to give blood to nourish the gods, which in turn, take, for example, the god Chak, which brings the rain. It's a personification of rain. Chak was the rain god who brought the rain to the crops, which provided sustenance and corn for the people, which therefore provided more life. Circle of life. And now it's on the Maya to actually give back. And for the Maya to do that, of course, you're going to give the blood, which nourishes the god, to complete that circle. They had a whole ritual. You can find it on the walls of the nunnery complex at Uxmal. I did a video on this on my YouTube channel where I explained the symbolism and the relief, where they would literally use the tailbone of a stingray to perforate themselves, and then they would catch the blood in a parchment and light that on fire to get the element of smoke. So you have the smoke of the blood that's on the parchment as a way to connect with the gods above. And to me, that's a very beautiful thing. It's a way of trying to honor the gods and connect with that which gives us life. It's a different understanding. It's the same for death. A lot of people fear death. Personally, I'm really excited for death. I love life. I'm very enthusiastic about life, but I'm also very, very much excited to see what's on the other side. You know, would I want to give it all up today? Not necessarily, but at the same time, I'm not someone who is I've done a lot of work, and I'm not someone who is trying to cling to this experience. I'm looking forward to moving on, and I'm not looking at death as the end. Death is just the great initiation. It's a brand new beginning. So, yeah.
No,
it would seem as though if you look at the reliefs and if you look at the symbolism and the language even of the Maya and these ancient traditions, even the Egyptians, they spent their entire lives building complexes, which we think they were obsessed with death, but they were just looking at the next stage. They were looking at the afterlife, and they had a way, just like shaman do, of connecting, which tells us that it's innate in all humanity, that as an extension, we all have the ability to go in and transcend and connect with the unseen world, with the other side. And that goes to the timeline as well.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful, beautiful. And one very quick last question from Mandy has to do with the sun discs. Is that right, Mandy?
Oh, no, I was just curious because you mentioned the barges. So I was just curious on the difference, because I'm still learning about some of this stuff. So
there's a lot to learn.
Yes, no, I'm finding that. So I'm just curious on the difference between the barges and the solar barges, and the significance of the sun disk, not only in the Egyptian religion, but there's different other religions that they sort of draw this sun disk.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about the barges, and you had the day barge and the night barge, and that was a way of metaphorically, sometimes even expressing the sky or the change of transition periods from the dawn and into the day, from day into night, night into day, which always corresponds. We have to use the esoteric principle of correspondence. It always corresponds day into night. The unseen into the seen, spirit into matter, matter into spirit. All those same cycles are being represented. The sun, there's so much symbolism that is around the sun. It's often people misconstrue or think that they were worshiping the sun. I tend to think it was more of a veneration for a sun. They understood the greater source, but a lot of these ancient cultures would use the sun as a symbol to express that connection to the creator or the divine or the cosmic consciousness, everything that is beyond, which the sun is an extension of itself. Sun isn't the creator, but we wouldn't be here without the sun. We need the sun. So you have like the cult of Akhenaten, who revered the sun and wanted to place importance on the Aten, the sun again. And yes, of course, you're going to see it in many cultures, just like the serpent. It's a universal symbol. Everybody has the sun. Everybody is seeing a serpent. And these symbols often carry the same meanings in many traditions across the globe.
Even in the Catholic tradition, you have the Eucharist, which is a symbol of the sun, and its counterpart would be the wine, which symbolizes the blood.
The blood.
Mm-hmm.
Did they
and birds. Go ahead, Mandy.
So was this sun disk represented by the gold disc that they find in some tombs?
I would have to know which gold disc you're referring to. I would guess, my best educated guess without seeing the specific disc would be to say yes. If you have a disc, it's probably related to the sun disk. You'll often see it on the statues. Sometimes it's above their head, representing, which could also be signaling. See, the Egyptians, it wasn't just one thing. There's a lot of multiplicity and spatial awareness. Mm-hmm. Yes, it may be the sun, but it could be representing a form of attainment or a level of consciousness as well. It could be part of a holiday as well for them. There's usually multiple meanings that are wrapped up into one symbol. And that's a big difference we see between the ancient Egyptians and then, let's say, the later dynasties, or like the Ptolemaic Greeks. In the beginning, there wasn't even much writing. It was just the structures. The structures were speaking to us. Then the hieroglyphs were introduced. And then at that time, you would have one symbol that had many meanings. It meant a variety of things. When the Greeks started to come into Egypt, they had to understand it in a different way. They had to apply more symbols, more determinatives, more glyphs to go along with a symbol to express an idea. It's a classic example. It's like earlier, it took me 15 minutes to say something the Queen of Courts said in 2 seconds. She's like the ancient Egyptian, and I'm like the Greeks trying to explain it. And so I think that's the same thing we're seeing across cultures around the world. And so the sun may carry many meanings.
Sorry.
It could also be the crown chakra if it's depicted above the head.
Yes.
Brushing out the solar
Corona.
chakra. Yeah.
Well, we have kept you way beyond the amount of time we had originally intended to, but it's just been such an enjoyable conversation, getting to know more about you and what you have to offer and picking your brain.
It's been a blast. I think you guys, I didn't even expect the question. I didn't know what to expect. I just figured it would be the typical standard question. You guys have some great research. I can tell that everybody here is another one of me. You're very in la catch, we say, among the Maya tradition. Everyone has a really, it seems like a deep passion for exploring a lot of this. So I really appreciate the questions, and I appreciate your time and having me on your program. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And we would love to stay in touch with you. I urge, and so does Audrey, she's been putting it in there. I've been following you for a long time, but I tell you folks, sign up, follow him on Facebook, go to his YouTube channel, take a look at these videos, because he gets into places that nobody else gets into, and it's fascinating what he finds. Watch the one on the bent pyramid.
Yeah,
that was fantastic. Also, the one in Central America.
Yeah,
the one that nobody else has been in. Yeah, been in both of those.
The melted steps at Bandera. That's fascinating too.
And you have an open invitation anytime you'd like to come on and talk about anything, or have someone. We have different folks we can pull in that have a lot of research too. If you want to shoot the breeze anytime, but I know you don't have a lot of time to do that. But.
Yeah, I would love to come back and do it again. We can chat about a variety of different topics. Again, I appreciate the time today, but I would be more than happy to come back again at some point.
Oh, wonderful!
Well, we wish you well with your tour. Now you still have a couple spots open, right? You still have a couple. Maybe
we do.
Two?
We have 2, maybe 3, because one of the other guests in Australia is considering just holding off another year. So we might have 3 for this one, but right now I definitely have 2 more spots left open before it's sold out. You can learn more about that at our website, adeptexpeditions.com. You could register there, make a deposit to secure your spot. And it's going to be a legendary tour. I mean, it's really special, especially with Chris Dunn being there. We don't know how many more times Chris Dunn's going to be coming to Egypt. So this is the one that you want to go on if you're thinking about coming.
Yeah, we'd like to. Is it Karina, your wife, Karina?
Yes, Karina eats Coatle.
Yes. Well, maybe someday when she's feeling better and back on her feet, and you've got this tour under your belt, she'll be willing to come on and talk about some of her experiences with you too, right? You have the tours down there as well.
Yeah,
Central American tours.
She would enjoy that. She's actually working on a book now, and she's really the hidden gem. People come to the Maya tours because they know me from the internet. They don't, her internet presence isn't out there as much, but they're always blown away by Karina. They love what I do, but they really love when she can get into, she is so immersed in the indigenous traditions of her family and her culture, as well as she's well read on Western esotericism. She reads Gurdjieff, and she's a gem and a teacher to me. I learn from her all the time, and so I'm sure she would love to do the show. She's actually, we've seen a significant increase in her vitality and health in the last couple of months. She's finally getting out more, so we're really excited about that.
Good.
Yeah, I know she's been through a rough time there. Yeah. Well, we wish you well, and thank you so very much for spending all this time with us and the additional time. I can't believe we went that far over.
Fascinating.
But loved having you next, and thank you, panelists, for participating, and folks in the chat room for hanging in there. We got folks who are like, keep it going. No, we've kept it going.
I have to get this video uploaded because it's time sensitive. It's about this new discovery. So
there you go.
We can continue.
First one watching it.
We can continue the conversation in the comment section on my next video. I'll be there.
Awesome.
Also, looking forward to seeing it.
Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you, everyone in the chat room.
Bye,
Peace
everybody.
out. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.